In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a pretty common issue when we're digitizing satin stitches, and that is a situation where we have a split in an object like this. So here we're dealing with ribbon, but in another situation that is similar is with a heart shape. So we have the two top halves of the heart, they kind of have this split in the middle, and when we're dealing with satin rails, it doesn't allow us to effectively treat the point here. Okay, so we cannot treat this as one object. So what we have to do is we have to create two objects in order for that to happen. So what we're going to do here is let's just first draw some lines to kind of represent this ribbon. So we'll get that in place first. And then so we'll do something like that. Now, currently, the way I've drawn this, and I've kind of done this deliberately just so you guys have a better understanding of all the little details. So you can see here, we've got these two lines, and then I believe this is one, okay? So that's how it's currently drawn. So what we're going to do is we're just going to select all of those paths, and then we're going to come up here, and we're going to choose Path and Combine, okay? So we'll choose Path and Combine. And then we're not quite done. And this path is now, you can see it is quote unquote one, but our nodes are not one. So we're going to double click on our path, and you can see we kind of go into our node editor. And then these two nodes that make up these two individual paths that were there, we're just going to click this, join selected nodes. And then you can see we're going to do the same thing over here, join selected nodes. Okay, now you didn't actually see anything really happen. It's not really different per se, but that is very necessary to the way InkStitch thinks about things, okay? So now what we can do is we can kind of fine tune. So if we want to fine tune our lines here a little bit to make it more, shall we say, ribbony, these nodes we don't actually even need, so we can control that. So this one we don't need, nor this one do we need, and we can give it just a little bit of shape. Okay. So let's go ahead and just pull this away from the original graphic because I think this might be better for us to look at. So imagine, if you will, you had a vector shape, okay, and then that you weren't drawing it all independently. How would we break this up so it will stitch properly the way we expect? And you know, honestly, for something that's relatively simple and easy, the steps involved might kind of surprise you that it's a bit more complicated than just click, click, and you're done. If you understand the principles, it's pretty easy, but surprisingly, there's a little bit to it. So let me just show you what we have to do. So these two lines here will become our main satin rails, and just for illustrative purposes, I'm going to go ahead, double click right here, and I'm just going to add a node right here. And then I'm just going to delete this one. And the only reason I'm doing that is so our satin, this node on the bottom is more in line with the one on top, just so that satin stitches that we're going to generate will be kind of directly across from one another. Now, here's where it gets a little bit interesting and a little bit tricky. Each of these points have to be separate from the main satin. So to do that, I'm going to hold Control and Alt and click on this path over here, roughly straight across. Bop. Roughly straight across. Bop. And by holding the Control and Alt key, that will add a node to that existing path. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to break these nodes right here. So we want that one, hold our Shift key, that one, hold our Shift key, and that one. We want to break all those nodes. Okay. So you can come up here and click Break Path at Selected Nodes. Okay. So now what do we have? So if you look here, nothing happened. We still have a path. And that's because we haven't actually broken the path. We broke the nodes, but not the path. Okay, so now if we come up here to path and we choose break apart, now we're going to get what we expected almost. So let me just show you. So here we have a path, and here we have a path, but in order to have satin, we know that we have to have those paths combined. So we'll choose path and combine. Now that can be converted to satin, okay? So we know that when we're creating satin, we need what we call 2 rails, and so that's what this is now, 2 rails, okay? But what about this? What do we have down here? Well, we have a single path, and that's problematic, okay? Because we need 2. We need 2. So what we have to do in order to convert these points into satin, then we have to do this. So we'll double click on it to go into the node tool. We have to break that node right there, break. And then down over here, we have to break this node, break. Now where it gets a little bit confusing here is previously you just saw where we had to break a path. But in this case, we don't break the path because now this piece becomes a rail and this piece becomes a rail. And then this piece becomes a rail, and this piece becomes a rail because we broke the node. So I know that that initial concept of that can be just a little bit unnerving. Doesn't maybe quite make sense. So, and I totally get it because it didn't really make sense to me either till that one aha moment where I was like, oh, okay, I got it now. All right, so now you could see how big this is. You can see it is basically 2 by 2. So that's okay. I don't know how big the original graphic was, but this will convert to satin, no issues. So we're not too concerned about that. But let's go ahead and convert it to satin because we're not quite done yet. So we'll go ahead and go into params here, and we'll go ahead and convert that into satin. One note to make about satin is we cannot have fill with satin. So we have a path with a stroke. So when we get into this next params dialog box, if you don't see the option for satin, it's because you have a fill. Almost absolutely. Okay, so now you can see that we have beautiful satin. Okay, no issues there. All right, just by doing what we just did. Now you may wish to I'm going to show you this here just in a minute, but you can kind of see in the preview how we have just that slight, tiny little bit of overlap already. Okay, you can see that. So you may choose to want more overlap than that, if possible. But I want to talk about how this is stitching because this is where most people, they don't quite really understand why and how and all the details about a good embroidery file. So let's see how it stitches. It's starting from the bottom top. You see where it's starting from the bottom top right there? You see what I'm talking about? So it starts up here and comes down here. And that cannot be that way. That should not be that way. So that's problematic right there. So let's keep going. And you can see that it starts at the top and it goes down to this point, which again cannot be that way. Okay, and this is where the devil is really in the details because a lot of people would just leave that. Okay, and that is no good. All right, so let's keep going here, and then you could see that this piece is starting from the top down, which again, no, right? So literally every single piece of this is not stitching the way we want it to stitch. And so this becomes problematic. So let's just go ahead and hit apply and quit for right now. So now we kind of have to go to the next step. Okay, and the next step is understanding a little bit about InkStitch and how it stitches and why it stitches the way it does and some other information here. So to begin with, you could see that path number 6, whatever's in the lowest most order of the layers palette, that's what's going to stitch first, which that makes sense. That's why this stitched first, and then path 5 is this, and finally path 4 is that. Okay, so that's good. Now, there are a couple of different ways to change how these things are stitching and so forth, and I'm going to do that in params. I think it's easiest to do in params. There's other ways to do it, but let's go back into params. So I have a keyboard shortcut of Control-Alt-P, take me back into params, and basically all we have to do is, you can see this is stitching from top to bottom. We need to stitch from bottom to top. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose the swap rails option, and then you can see that it does in fact stitch from the bottom to the top. Okay, so that's easy enough. Hit apply and quit. We're done with that. Okay, now same thing over here. Go back into params, and we're going to do the exact same thing. It's stitching from top to bottom, as you can see. So we need to stitch from bottom to top. Okay, and there we go there. So now we know that's stitching properly. And then lastly, we need to do the same thing with the big piece. So let's go back to the params there. And we're going to choose swap rails. And again, it's going to stitch from bottom to top. Okay, so all that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and just go back in. Let's go ahead and this time, instead of going into params, we're going to go into simulator. And we're going to see how this stitches. Okay, now initially that looks good. Like that more or less looks like we expected it to. But there's a but that we're not seeing. And the but is we have not turned on the frogs. The dreaded frogs. So we're going to go ahead and click on the little frog icon, and now you can see what the issue is. And this is a very, very big issue. You see it in just about every embroidery design out there, because a lot of people don't understand how to control thread jumps. Okay, now when I first started with InkStitch, this is something that really, really, really bothered me, and it was really quite frustrating. So you can see here our first frog. We kind of ignore this first frog. Really, this frog is where we have to battle. So we have to kill the frogs. Okay, so let's show you how we're going to kill the frog. Let's go back to here, and this is why we don't want this. Now, is this a huge deal in this particular example? No, because watch what happens as we advance. And by the way, something that could be helpful to you, if you want to advance stitch by stitch by stitch as you're editing your designs and looking at things, you can do that with your arrow keys. Okay, so that may be of interest, to just go through it stitch by stitch by stitch. But what I want to show you here is when this piece finishes, it's going to jump to the tip of this piece because that's where the next piece starts. Now, in this particular example, it's not a huge issue because the entire jump stitch is covered by the new stitches. But there is a but here, okay? And this could be really important depending on how big this embroidery design is. Every time that you have this thread jump, it's as if you have a thread trim. And when we're creating embroidery files, we want to minimize thread trims, we want to minimize thread jumps, because the machine has to slow down. Okay, so the machine slows down, makes the jump, and then speeds back up again. But we don't want the machine to slow down. We want the machine to be going full bore throughout. Okay, because if it had 50 of these, and the machine had to slow down 50 times to make a jump, and then speed back up 50 times. No, we don't want that, right? Time is money. So we want, when we start the machine, we want it to go full bore till it's done, if possible. Okay, so then we go ahead and fast forward and watch what's happening here. So what's happening here is it's finishing this piece of the ribbon, and then it's jumping. Look where it's jumping to. The next object is beginning way over here. See that? Well, we don't want that object to start way over there. We finished right up here. So why can't our object, the next object, start right there? Why would it jump all the way to the other side? Okay? And that's just because of how InkStitch works, and we haven't told it to do anything different, so it doesn't know to do anything different. Okay? So these are all the little things. Converting it to stitches is one thing. Getting it to stitch out properly, that's an entirely different animal. So let me just go in here and look at this in params, is where we would deal with that issue. So we're in params, and let's just back up here. So let's back up and look at where it's starting. You can see it's starting here on what I would call the bottom right. And we need it to start on the top left. But how do we do that? So we've already selected swap rails, which I'm going to temporarily uncheck that option because we may not want to ultimately use that option. So there is another option here called reverse rails, and you notice it says, normally it's going to say automatic, but we're going to say, what if we reverse the first rail? And notice what happens as soon as we did that. So as soon as we did that, now it's starting on the top left, okay? Now, I will be the first to tell you that sometimes it's a combination. Okay, it worked in this particular example, but it doesn't work this way exactly in every example. So sometimes we have to have swap rails and reverse first rail. Sometimes we just need swap rails. Sometimes in this case we just need reverse first rail, or one of these options. Okay, so it's a combination of options. Eventually we're going to get it to start and stop where we want it to start and stop. Okay, so that's really the takeaway. So sometimes we want to control where it starts, other times we want to control where it ends, and this is how we handle that. Some combination of swap rails, some combination of one of these options. And we can control where it starts and stops. In other words, if I were to fast forward through this, it's ending here. You can see where it's ending. It's here ending, that plus is ending on over here on the right hand side. So just for fun, right, I want to say, okay, I want it to start at the top left, and for whatever reason I want it to end at the top left. Right now it's starting at the top left but ending at the bottom right. So how do we control that? I want them both to start and stop at the same point. Well, we've chosen the reverse first rail. What if we added swap rails to that? Okay, so now you can see we can't do that because of what's happened here. Okay, it's starting over here and we don't want it to start over there. So what if we left swap rails but we said reverse the second rail? What would that do? Okay, well, it is, I believe it's starting at the bottom, but it's finishing at the top. So now it's finishing where we want it to, but it is not starting where we want it to, I don't believe. Let's back up where it starts. Yeah, so it starts down here, and we don't want it to start down there necessarily. What I want to try and do is control both, where it starts and where it ends. So we've chosen swap rails. Let's leave that in place, and let's go ahead and what would happen if we choose reverse both rails? I don't know. I'll be honest with you. Okay, so if we choose reverse both rails, then we get this result, which clearly we don't want. So what if I were to turn off swap rails? What do we get? We get the same thing. Okay, so that one's out. What if we choose don't reverse? I think that's the only option. Okay, so that one's out. We can't do that. So really, we're down to we can either reverse the first rail, which we don't want because it is ending where we want it to end, but it's starting over here, which we don't want. So we've gone this whole big circle, right? We've exhausted every potential option here. All right. So I know this is a simple project, but I think it's one that's really important to understand more specifically. All right. So now we're here. This, I believe, is going to be our best point. It's starting down here, and in this particular example, because we want it to end up here. Now, why would we want it to end at the top versus the bottom? Okay, I'm just saying hypothetically, if we want it to end at the top, why? Well, if it was jumping to another object that was closer to the top than it is to the bottom, then that's why we might want it to end at the top over the bottom. It's what's happening next. If nothing's happening next, well then no, it doesn't matter if it ends at the top or the bottom. But if it's jumping to an object that's right here, then obviously we would want that jump to happen right there versus the jump from over here all the way across and up. Okay, so that is the thing to keep in mind. So just for illustration purposes, we're going to say we need it to start at the top. But we don't need no jump stitches to start down here. Okay, so I'm just going to choose apply and quit. And let's look at this. Couple of different things that we could do here. Right now, this is stitching first, and this is stitching second. So we could just flip-flop those two. That's going to stitch, then this, then this. Okay? Now let's see what happens when we do that. So I'm going to just go back into Simulator here. And hopefully, like when you get through this video, it'll all make a little bit more sense to you of what's happening here. So let's back up to our first frog, and you can see it's finishing up here, and it's starting way down here. Okay. Now, really, what we need is we need this piece to finish right there. Okay. So let's go ahead and close this out and do that. Make it do that. So we do that in params. Okay. So we've kind of already seen this where we chose swap rails. I'm going to undo that and just reverse the first rail. And you'll see that it does start at the bottom, but it also finishes at the inside where we wanted it to. So see that? Where it's starting and finishing on the inside. Very good. Apply and quit. Okay. Now this piece, we want it to start where that one ended, but we want it to go, so from here, we're going to come down here, and it's going to stitch up and end over here. So let's see if it actually does that. And it starts at the bottom, and where is this one ending? And this was ending at the top, which we don't want, so we know to uncheck swap rails and reverse the first rail. It is going to start at the bottom still, but you'll notice that it's stopping at the outside right. So that is correct. Okay? So that is correct. So now let's just look at this in simulator mode so you can get an idea of how this is going to stitch out and a couple of other things that we need to be mindful of. So it's stitching, 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 and then it's moving on to this, and then it's moving on to that. But we haven't turned on the frogs. So now we have to turn on the frogs. And now you can see what's happened here. Where before we had two frogs, didn't we? Now we just have this one frog that's going from where this ends, and it's coming down to where this begins. Okay? And that's what we have to ultimately eliminate. So let me show you how we're going to do that. So to eliminate this problem, and this comes up often, and it's often an overlooked step, and I have many examples of more detailed designs where we cover this topic. I'll try to link to some of those videos in the listing description so you have direct access to them, but it's all about routing and pathing. Routing and pathing. So if you're looking for a video on routing and pathing, you can use that term because that's what I use in the video titles. Routing and pathing. But I have lots of examples of this. So, but basically what we have to do is we have to take this piece and this piece, shift click both. So we've got both of those selected. You can see they're both selected here. And we're going to go up here to extensions and choose InkStitch. And then we're going to come down here to the tool stroke. And you notice it says jump stitch to stroke. And you notice I do have a keyboard shortcut because it's something I use all the time. So when we hit Control Alt J, go ahead and do that. It's going to bring up this dialog box. And here, this is the settings that I typically use. And essentially what it's saying is if there's a jump stitch in these selected objects and it exceeds 2 millimeters, go ahead and make this stroke for me. But you can see here that convert jump stitches that are not longer than, that's just another parameter that we can add to it. And these are some additional parameters that says do not connect after a trim or a stop or a force lock. Okay, those are additional options for you. Now you can choose this live preview option, and it will then, before actually applying it, you see that the stroke has now been added, right? So now we can hit apply, and now we have a stroke between those two objects. Okay, one thing that is kind of a bit of annoying is that we do have to manually close this dialog box. So once we hit apply, we do have to manually close it. But now you'll see that we have the two pieces that we had originally selected, 5 and 6, and then the jump stitch that's in between now. Okay, so now, and in this particular case, we don't have to modify the jump stitch in any way because our satin stitches will cover the jump stitch in its entirety. We could, if we wanted to, select, just double click on it, add a node, and modify. This becomes a running stitch, okay? And it's a running stitch because it has a dashed line. So we go ahead and any dashed lines are automatically considered running stitches. So for example, if your machine stitches at 1,000 stitches a minute, it's going to just stitch that 1,000 stitches a minute. It's not going to slow down for nothing. Okay, and because it's going to stitch this object, and then it's going to go right into that run stitch, right into the satin stitch, right into this satin stitch. Just boom, 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 boom. Okay, so yes, that's stitching exactly the way we want it to. Now you can see we talked earlier about this overlap. That's maybe one more thing, the one last thing to maybe talk about is if I move this particular path forward, just a tiny bit of overlap. See that? Tiny little bit of overlap. Tiny bit of overlap. And now let's look at it again in simulator mode. Make sure you're going into simulator mode and not into params, okay? Because it's just easier to see here. Now, I did it kind of to the extreme, but I just wanted to show you how much different that looked because I pulled those paths forward that we had more overlap, okay? So I just was doing that, again, I just did that to the extreme just to show you could control that overlap a little bit, all right? So that might be something that you consider. I am going to back out of there because, believe it or not, there's a couple more things I wanted to talk about. As long as we're discussing this, I think it's useful. If you understand all the ins and outs and butts and pieces, it will make your digitizing process much easier. And I did not have this information when I started learning InkStitch. There wasn't a lot of detailed, there still isn't a lot of detailed information out there. But let's go back into params one more time, if you will allow me to do that. Because I want to talk about one more thing here, and I think it's worth mentioning for this particular example. And that is the often overlooked push and pull compensation. Okay, so you can visually see that there is a stitch or two of overlap between this object, and the big object, right? There's a stitch or two overlap. You can clearly see that. All right. I am going to, the one other thing we haven't talked about yet is underlay. So I am going to add zigzag underlay, and I'm going to add contour underlay. And by doing that, now the need for zigzag or contour underlay just depends on your situation. It's kind of not the scope of the video. But I wanted to add contour underlay specifically so we could see the effects a little bit easier when we choose the push and pull compensation. Okay, so let's start with the, in this case, the pull compensation. So with satin stitches, you could choose pull compensation with a percentage of each side. So we can add by percentage, or we can add by millimeters. Now, typically, I like to add by percentage. Okay, so if I'm going to add, and what I want you to pay close attention to here is the amount that's sticking over the, this is the contour underlay, this line, and the amount of overlap. Okay, so I'm going to first do it to the extreme. 20% is the extreme. And now you could see just how much overlap there is, right? But the and the other thing I wanted to point out is this right here. Okay. Now, hopefully, if you rewind the video back a little bit, you'll see this all hopefully kind of click a bit more for you. The main thing I wanted to point out, no matter how much pull compensation we offer, the distance between these two objects never changes. So the amount of overhang between these two objects never changes, no matter how much pull compensation we offer. And you could see that quite clearly here, right? Because you see how much. Now you notice that this overhang differs from this, okay? And the reason for that is because we added compensation based on percentages, okay? So we said 20%. 20% of this wide object is different than 20% of this more narrow object, okay? So this is a situation where maybe you would not want to add the pull compensation based on percentages because these two objects are different. So if we were to add by 5 millimeters, watch the difference. So let's say we add pull compensation of 5 millimeters on each side. Again, that was probably an extreme example, but you get my point, okay? Now you see that the amount of overhanging the contour underlay is 5 millimeters on the small object and 5 millimeters on the big object, okay? So let me back this up to say, I don't know, 1 millimeter, or maybe, okay, yeah, let's just go with 1. I think that will illustrate my point enough. Okay, so what point am I trying to get to? Well, this is the point that I'm trying to get to. If we look here, you see by adding 1 millimeter of overlap, you can see that the new corner point is up here, not down there. If I take that away, now you can see where the connecting point is, right? So here's the point that I want to make. If I want to add a couple more stitches overlap between these two objects, I can do that, but then if I do that, it's going to have a flat point here. So maybe I add a 0.5 millimeter compensation, and now you can see it's moved that connecting point up here to allow for those couple extra stitches. Okay. So you should always add pull compensation to your satin stitches, and especially with really wide satin columns like we have here. Okay. So that's something else to consider too. Now, as long as I've bored you to death up to this point, I think there is something that's worth talking about, and that's needle points. Okay? And now this is not important in this case, but it is important to consider when you're designing satin columns. Okay, so if you noticed here, the needle points, you see all these little red dots? This is where your needle points are. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and choose the apply and quit here. So let's go ahead and apply and quit that, because I want to blow this up quite a bit bigger, something like that, and then go back into params and see if I forced it, if I blew it up enough to do something crazy. So I'm turning on my needle points, and no. Yes, yes and no. So here's what we got. So I turned on, so this is a satin column, but this is an extremely wide satin column. So we can tell it, for example, let's see here. We can tell it the maximum stitch length that we want for satin. So let's just say, I don't know, we're just making stuff up as we go. Let's say I want it to be 7 millimeters, okay? So do you see all these additional stitch points? Those solid red lines is where the needle is, okay? So sometimes we need to represent a very wide satin column, right? But obviously on the embroidery machine, we wouldn't really want to jump. If we told it maximum stitch length of 7 millimeters, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's like nearly 60 millimeters wide. Well, you can't have a satin column that wide, okay? The general rule of thumb is probably realistically, if it's a worn garment, 9 millimeters. I probably wouldn't want to go over 9. So, I mean, that value can differ, it's personal preference, but me personally, I probably wouldn't want to go over 9. But there are times where we do need to represent a wide satin column, okay? And this is how we define that. So we're going to say we don't want a stitch length greater than 7, but we can choose the random jitter here, which really helps with not having a very defined needlepoint positions. Okay, so for example, if I say 50% random jitter, I want you to see what happens. And now you can see that we have no stitches greater than 7, but we got needle points everywhere. Okay, and that randomness, when it's actually stitched out, actually looks really good and represents a satin stitch the best of our ability when it's super wide like that. Okay, now obviously this is an extreme example. We would never have a satin column that wide, but if you're kind of skirting the edge, if you're at 9, if you want to be at 9 and you're at 15, this is a really good way to handle that. Okay, so that's kind of all the ins and outs of some of the various options that are available to you. If we go back under zigzag underlay, yeah. So even on that zigzag, this is just an important note. If we are dealing with super wide satin columns, make sure when you're doing your zigzags that you also specify a maximum stitch length too. So like I might choose 5, for example. So you can choose that so that the zigzag being placed, these stitches aren't too long as well. Okay, so that's just something else to be mindful of. All right. There's a little bit more to it. Okay, so I'm sorry if I went a little overboard and extreme, but if we do understand all those various principles, then when we go to actually stitch this thing out, we know better how to handle it and various different situations. So I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching.